SBP is a disaster recovery and resilience nonprofit working to shrink the time between disaster and recovery. As part of that goal, we have partnered with the Walmart Foundation to present webinars focused on educating disaster recovery leaders to fortify people against unnecessary suffering. SBP has 5 interventions: building efficiently, sharing our model with other organizations, preparing home and business owners through resilience training, advising municipal and state officials, and advocating for policy changes and improvements to the disaster recovery industry. We believe in a holistic approach to disasters, increasing resilience before and streamlining recovery after. We ask that you please join us for our future webinars. The links to register will be available in the slides we send out later today. Additionally, we have an upcoming Response to Recovery LPC in May. If you are interested in attending, please reach out to me for more information or simply use the link on the slide to register. We also have a 2-day disaster housing course. This course has a wide range of key topics to equip leaders to be effective and efficient construction managers. There is a cost per seat to attend. The prices, as you can see on the screen, are listed. If you are interested, please reach out to me, or again, simply use the link on the slide to register. This is just to give you some general information of some of our SBP advice offerings. If you have any questions or need any information, again, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. Social media is one of the easiest ways to keep up with what the advice team is doing, so we ask that you follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook. Now I will pass it over to our disaster recovery advisor, Joshua Bryant.
Hey, good morning, and thank you, Maria. So today I will be providing a high-level overview of FEMA's history in the programs offered under the Stafford Act. These slides are meant to crack the door into these programs, but will not deep dive into the specific recovery programs such as public assistance or individual assistance. As mentioned, my name is Joshua Bryant, and I recently joined SBP as the Disaster Recovery Advisor. Previously, I served as the Recovery Division Chief for the state of Texas, where I was responsible for the disaster declaration process, securing federal recovery funding, and managing multi-billion-dollar recovery grants. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is scheduled for 1 hour. My plan is to present for approximately 30 minutes, leaving plenty of time for questions. As Maria mentioned, if you have questions, please enter it into the chat. As we work through today's webinar, I encourage you to think about your areas of responsibility and the gaps and questions that exist related to the federal emergency management programs. You will see 3 themes or simple ideas spread throughout today's session. We believe that as community leaders, you should keep these things in mind as you begin to work within FEMA's programs. First, disasters begin and end locally. This is foundational to emergency management programs in the United States. Disaster impacted citizens, local governments, and nonprofits and businesses are the first to cope with a disaster and its damages and really maintain control and responsibility of resources as a community recovers from a disaster. This webinar will primarily focus on FEMA programs, but please keep this first idea in mind because the majority of disaster recovery work occurs at the local and state levels and not specifically at the federal level. Second, government assistance will never fully return a community back to its pre-disaster condition. The programs we discussed today are meant to be supplemental relief programs, but they will never substitute for personal preparedness or insurance. And then finally, recovery and resilience programs that we will review today are complicated and is vital for community leaders to develop internal expertise in order to successfully navigate these programs. Next slide, please. All right, jumping in, emergency management programs in the United States are scalable. So what does this mean? It means it has the ability to expand or contract as needed, depending on the scale and scope of a disaster emergency. As mentioned during the last slide, every disaster begins and ends and is managed at the local level. However, there are support systems in place to allow for different levels of government to provide support and resources to communities when they are overwhelmed and beyond their capacity to respond to an incident. We introduced this concept first because you will see it serve as the foundation for the rules and programs that we discuss. And this concept also helps explain where FEMA came from. Next slide, please. So from 1803 to 1950, Congress passed 128 separate laws relating to disaster relief. A lack of comprehensive legislation required Congress to pass a law following each and every disaster that they were providing support to from the federal level. This was happening because the needs following each disaster were different depending on where the disaster occurred and the resources of each community. In 1950, Congress enacted a untitled Federal Disaster Relief Act that enabled the state government to request federal assistance through the president. This legislation was foundational in establishing a philosophy that federal disaster assistance would supplement the efforts of state and local governments and available resources, but would not supplant them. In 1979, a partial meltdown of the 3 Mile Island nuclear generating station required more than 100 federal entities to coordinate response efforts. Ultimately, this disaster response effort was fragmented and messy, and it reinforced a need of a central federal coordinated entity in order to respond to disasters. President Carter established FEMA after this disaster to consolidate emergency preparedness, mitigation, recovery, and response activities into a single federal agency responsible for emergency management. And then finally, FEMA's authorities were further defined and expanded by a disaster relief and emergency assistance amendment of 1988, which amended the Disaster Relief Act and renamed it the Robert T. Stafford Act, which is what we'll talk about the bulk of our programs today. Next slide, please. So the Stafford Act provides a clear direction and establishes our roles as emergency managers, as well as provides the current statutory framework for disaster response and recovery through the presidential disaster declaration process. When resources exceed the capabilities of state, local, tribal, or territorial governments, a declaration may be submitted by the governor or the tribal executive. And this declaration request, if approved, will allow supplemental federal assistance to be provided to that impacted locality. In later slides, we'll talk about this declaration process in more detail and the types of assistance that will be available to state and local governments. Next slide, please. There are 7 titles or chapters in the Stafford Act. And through each, you'll find the different phases of emergency management. The Act enables FEMA to direct, coordinate, manage, and fund eligible response and recovery efforts associated with domestic major disasters and emergencies that overwhelm the state's local governments, tribal or territorial resources that are at hand. The Stafford Act remains the formal and legal foundation for our roles as leaders in emergency management. Next slide, please. When FEMA was formally established, they mirrored a common federal regional structure used to provide more opportunities for intergovernmental coordination and to accomplish the FEMA mission of helping people before and after disasters. FEMA's work really occurs at the regional levels. And so, Maria, if you'll go to the next slide, I encourage everyone on this call to build a strong and collaborative relationship with their FEMA regional staff. And it's one of the more pressing recommendations that I could give to new emergency managers. Each region has a program or policy expert that can help you or your organization navigate some of the more complicated FEMA programs. And it's important to make sure that you're working with the right group of people, depending on your area of responsibility. In my previous role, one of the more common pieces of frustration and mistakes that I saw from local government leaders was trying to work through either FEMA headquarters or the FEMA regional administrator to solve problems and not really getting anywhere with those positions. Generally, both groups are primarily responsible to liaison between state elected officials and appointed officials and federal elected officials and appointed officials, as well as other federal agencies. In my opinion, you'll get more traction from FEMA by working with the divisional leadership at the regional level and their teams, which have responsibility for areas for areas like recovery, mitigation, preparedness, response, and so on. If you do not know who your FEMA regional staff counterparts are, I do encourage you to work through your state emergency management office to find opportunities to meet and work with this team. So they are almost always at any kind of state emergency management conferences, exercises. They deploy to joint field offices and sometimes to state EOCs. And there's generally a lot of opportunities to look for them and to work with them if you know where to look. Next slide, please. All right. So once organized, FEMA assumed 3 fundamental roles in emergency management. The first is a preparedness and mitigation fundamental, and that is to raise risk awareness, educate in risk reduction, and to help take action before disasters. Second, they assumed a response-based fundamental, which is to alert, warn, and message during disasters, to coordinate federal response, and to apply and manage resources following a disaster. And then third is a recovery and mitigation-based fundamental, which is to coordinate federal recovery efforts, provide resources, and to apply insight into future risk following a disaster. Next slide, please. In addition to FEMA's fundamental roles in emergency management, the agency also has team members devoted to preparing communities, reducing suffering, and spreading recovery programs that are not specifically tied to a disaster. For instance, the National Flood Insurance Program and other resilience programs are designed to reduce future losses to homes, businesses, schools, public buildings, and critical facilities through increasing awareness, funding pre-disaster mitigation work, and providing insurance. National preparedness connects individuals, organizations, and communities with research and tools to build and sustain capabilities and to prepare for future disasters. The Office of Resilience, Integration, and Coordination works to ensure that activities are unified and coordinated across the different FEMA regions. And then the Grant Program Directorate provides grants to prepare local governments and non-governmental entities to improve capabilities and reduce risk outside of declared disasters. And again, all of these programs are best accessed through either contacts at your state emergency management office and the regional division directors and their programs at FEMA. Next slide, please. So getting into the core of FEMA's programs, FEMA's business has been and likely will remain to be the coordination and delivery of support to citizens and state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. This primarily comes after the President of the United States issues a federal disaster declaration. We'll jump into this process next, but I do want to take a few minutes to review the slide that you see on your screen. First, every single county or parish in the United States has been under a disaster declaration at least once since 1953. So I mentioned that to say there is no part of the country that's explicitly removed from a threat of disaster. And then the second takeaway from this slide is there has been a sharp spike and increase in the number of federally declared major disasters in the United States. Of the 2,700 plus major declared disasters that have occurred since 1953, over 1,300 of those have occurred in the last 20 years. disasters in the US are becoming more common, more widespread, and more expensive. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And then before we move into the declaration process, I did want to briefly touch on how FEMA's programs are generally funded. So Congress makes an appropriation to something called the Disaster Relief Fund, which enables FEMA to direct, coordinate, manage, and fund eligible response and recovery efforts associated with domestic major disasters and emergencies that overwhelm state, local, tribal, and territorial resources. This is not an endless pot of funding, and there have been times that the disaster relief fund has been insufficient to meet all of the needs and demands from Stafford Act programs. During this time, FEMA may implement something called immediate needs funding, where FEMA prioritizes response to urgent response and recovery efforts. Since 2001, FEMA has implemented immediate needs funding 9 times, and that has effectively paused activities not necessary for life-saving or life-sustaining. This essentially boils down to what would be direct payments to disaster survivors and emergency response costs only, meaning that there would be a pause in funding for any kind of resilience activities or permanent infrastructure restoration. And I bring this up specifically because it does tie back to our second simple idea. Next slide, please, Maria. And it's that government assistance will not make you whole following a disaster. The recovery and resilience programs that we're about to jump into are meant to serve as a funding source of last resort, and those becoming increasingly more common that people and governments view this as a more of a safety net than it probably should be. I can't encourage you more that insurance coverage is definitely the more effective and streamlined and fastest route to complete disaster recovery, both at the individual level and at the organization or government level. And so when you all are having preparedness conversations with your stakeholders, please make sure to continue to push insurance, because these FEMA programs that we're about to jump into will never completely refill a cup following a disaster. Next slide, please. All right, moving into the disaster declaration process and how FEMA assistance programs come about. So per the Stafford Act, when resources exceed the capabilities of state, local, tribal, or territorial governments, the disaster declaration request may be submitted by the governor or chief tribal executive to receive supplemental federal assistance. According to 44 Code of Federal Regulation Part 206, this request must be submitted within 30 days of the occurrence of the incident. And unfortunately, there's a massive amount of work that is required to get to the point where the governor or chief tribal executive is able to submit his or her declaration request. The damage assessment process should be the first priority of local officials following a disaster once any threats to life and safety have passed. Working with state and federal officials, local should focus on collecting, validating, quantifying, and documenting the cause and location, as well as damage descriptions following a disaster. Damage assessments must assess damages to homes and public infrastructure separately, and exclude any costs that are covered by insurance or other funding sources. If a disaster is of such a scale and severity that damage assessments cannot be completed within 30 days, there is an option within regulation for a 30-day extension to this deadline, but they must be formalized in writing before the expiration of the original deadline is passed. Once a declaration request has been submitted, FEMA assesses the request to make a recommendation to the president. The president then either declares or denies federal assistance under the Stafford Act. We have seen these decisions made as quickly as 24 hours. And then my previous experience at a state emergency management office. I've seen some take as long as 11 months as well. If a declaration request is denied, the state has one opportunity to appeal this decision within 30 days of the denial. Next slide, please. According to federal law, each request for federal assistance must confirm the following. First, the situation is of such severity that effective response is beyond the capabilities of state and the effective local officials. Second, the federal assistance is necessary to supplement the efforts and available resources of local governments. Third, the governor has taken appropriate action under state law and directed the execution of the emergency management plan. And then fourth, the governor or chief tribal executive must outline the amount and severity of damages and losses caused by the disaster. The last item, as mentioned previously, often requires the most input from local stakeholders and is detailed during the damage assessment process, which is very time consuming. Next slide, please. There are three types of disaster declarations that can be granted under the Stafford Act. The first is a major disaster declaration. Second is an emergency declaration. And then the third is a fire management assistance declaration. The declaration process for a major disaster and an emergency declaration are essentially the same. And then a fire assistance declaration has some significant differences. We'll cover all three in today's session, but the majority of the rest of our time will focus on the major disaster declaration process and the programs underneath. A major disaster is defined as any natural catastrophe, regardless of cause, or excuse me, any natural catastrophe, or regardless of cause, any fire, flood, or explosion in any part of the United States, which is determined by the president to have caused damage sufficient and to the magnitude to warrant a major disaster. This definition is very important. First, it defines that assistance is only for disasters occurring within the United States or its territories. And then second, the cause of the disaster is specific. It's a natural catastrophe or, regardless of cause, any fire, flood, or explosion. As you'll see, missing from this definition are disasters including cyber attacks, mass shooter events, mass migration, among many other things. And some of the news generating disasters that we see often do not fit within this legal definition. Next slide, please. A lot of the frustration that I previously heard from local partners about not receiving a major disaster declaration was stemmed in either not understanding the definition of what the Stafford Act allows as a major disaster, or not being able to meet some of the foundational requirements of a request. It is very important to remember that while the recent disaster often feels like the most catastrophic thing to have ever impacted a community, FEMA makes a recommendation to the president based on law and policy, and that decision ultimately belongs to the White House of whether or not to declare or deny a request. As of this morning, there were 15 declaration repeal requests pending a federal decision. And FEMA will evaluate all of these on three cornerstone areas to determine whether or not to make a recommendation to the president. First, was the disaster a qualifying event? So that goes back to the definition. Second, are there unmet needs that exceed state and local capacity to respond to the disaster or to recover from the disaster? And then finally, were certain regulatory requirements met, like the timing, as well as the implementation of the state emergency management plan. While denies of federal assistance is often frustrating to state and local governments, negative determinations are generally rooted in one of these three cornerstone areas not being hit. Next slide, please. The Stafford Act defines three types of assistance programs that are available to state and local communities impacted by a disaster. The first is the Public Assistance Grant Program. Second is the individual assistance grant program, and the third is the hazard mitigation grant program. I mentioned earlier that damage assessments must assess damages to both homes and public infrastructure separately. This is because during the declaration process, the president may authorize one, two, or all three of these programs, but they are not all guaranteed or contiguous with one another. Depending on the type and severity of damages, the governor may request public assistance or individual assistance or both. And the governor must also specifically request hazard mitigation, but this cannot be granted as a standalone program. And either must accompany public assistance or individual assistance based on the need. Next slide, please. So the public assistance program is FEMA's largest grant program and provides funding to assist communities with responding to or recovering from major disasters or emergencies declared by the president. This program provides funding for emergency response activities to save lives and protect property, and assist with funding for permanently restoring community infrastructure affected by a disaster. Eligible applicants of this program include states and federally recognized tribal governments, U.S. territories, local governments, and certain private nonprofit organizations. Eligible work must be required as a result of the declared disaster. It must be located in a declared disaster area, and it must be the legal responsibility of an applicant. And it also must be undertaken at a reasonable cost. There is not a funding limit to eligible PA costs declared during a disaster. There is generally, however, a cost share match that we'll discuss in a few slides. Next slide, please. In order to receive a major disaster declaration for public assistance, 6 factors are outlined in 44 CFR Part 206 that the federal government, FEMA, and the president will assess when making their determinations. First, the estimated cost of assistance. Second, localized impacts. Third, insurance coverage. And fourth, hazard mitigation contributions, recent multiple disasters, and any other federal assistance programs that are available. Next slide. The most important factor is the estimated cost of assistance. In my experience, to receive a major disaster declaration for public assistance, 2 fiscal thresholds must be met. First, a state threshold, and then each individual county or parish must meet their individual thresholds for PA. On the slide, I've included a few examples of state thresholds from this fiscal year, FY24. And as you can see, they vary widely. And it's important to remember that these are uninsured damages that must be documented during the damage assessment process in order to meet qualifying costs for a public assistance disaster. In addition, each county or parish has a unique threshold as well that must also be met for that locality to be included in the disaster declaration that's requested. These thresholds are determined each October by multiplying the population from the last official census by the annual consumer price index. And so this would be the 2020 census multiplied by the 2024 or FY 2024 annual consumer price index. It means that generally state and county thresholds probably slightly increase each year, and then may have major swings each decade once the census population changes. Next slide, please. The president may also declare a disaster impacted area eligible for individual assistance. The IE program provides money and services directly to people in federally declared disaster areas whose property is damaged or destroyed, and their losses are not covered by insurance. There are several individual assistance programs that are available, and each must be specifically requested and granted during the declaration process. These include mass care and emergency assistance, crisis counseling and training, disaster unemployment assistance, disaster legal services, disaster case management, and then FEMA's largest program under the individual assistance branch, the Individuals and Households Program. IHP, or Individuals and Households Program, differs from other FEMA grant programs because it is funded directly to disaster survivors. And the IHP financial assistance is awarded to individuals or households based on maximum amounts, which change each fiscal year at the update of the Consumer Price Index. So for 2024, the maximum amount of financial assistance that's available through the individual and households program is $42,500 for housing assistance and $42,500 for other needs assistance. And like I said, this is generally different than other types of funding that's available through FEMA grant programs. Next slide, please. Also, unlike public assistance, there are no defined fiscal thresholds that must be met in order to qualify a disaster for individual assistance. Instead, FEMA evaluates a governor's request at the state level against 6 factors outlined in 44 CFR 206.48. And though FEMA claims that these factors are weighed equally, in my experience, the first 2 on the screen are the most important. The state fiscal capacity and resource availability, and then the number of uninsured homes and personal property losses. There is a specific formula that FEMA uses to calculate these totals and determine if IHP is warranted, and SBP plans on discussing that formula in more detail during a future webinar, and it relies heavily on calculating insurance coverage in force at the time of the disaster, and then rental assistance averages for disaster impacted communities. Next slide, please. Following a disaster declaration at the request of a governor, the president may make hazard mitigation grant program funds available to state and local governments. The purpose of the hazard mitigation grant program is to help communities implement hazard mitigation measures following a major disaster. And HMGP funds may be used for projects that will reduce or eliminate losses from future disasters. Funds may be used to protect either public or private property, or to purchase property that has been subjected to or is in danger of repetitive damages. The funding available under the hazard mitigation grant program is limited to 15% of the total cost of public assistance and individual assistance combined for any disaster, and is typically locked in at 12 months following the declaration of a disaster. Next slide, please. And then coming towards the end of today's session, I did want to touch on the other 2 types of declarations that are available under the Stafford Act just briefly. The second declaration type defined in the Stafford Act is an emergency declaration. The president can declare an emergency for any occasion or instance when the president determines federal assistance is needed. The difference here in an emergency declaration definition and a major disaster declaration definition is the line any occurrence or instance. And so emergency declarations supplant state and local response effort by providing emergency services for the protection of lives, property, public health, and safety, or to lessen and avert the threat of a catastrophe. And these types of declarations are most commonly issued for either pre-positioning events, like before a hurricane makes landfall, or some of the more news-generating events that we discussed previously that may not fit the definition of a major disaster. Next slide, please. And then the final type of disaster declaration made available under the Stafford Act is for fire management assistance. These declarations are for the management and control of fires on publicly or privately owned forest or grasslands, which may threaten such destruction as it would constitute a major disaster. A fire management assistance declaration process is initiated when the state submits a request for assistance to the FEMA regional administrator, and at the time of the request, a threat of a major disaster exists. So the entire process is accomplished on an expedited basis, and the FEMA decision is often rendered in a matter of hours. Declaration criteria for a fire management declaration significantly differs from a major emergency declaration. And specifically, the state must confirm that there's a threat to lives or property. Local and state resources are exhausted or nearly exhausted. There's a high fire danger that exists, and then there's the potential for major economic impacts caused by the fire. And as mentioned, all of these either request and or decisions are designated or delegated down from chief executives to lower levels of government in order to make these decisions. Next slide, please. I mentioned this earlier, but in most cases, any funding made eligible under the Stafford Act does have a match requirement. Generally, local jurisdictions pay for 25% of recovery and mitigation project costs, and 75% of the project cost is paid by federal funding. The exception to this requirement is for certain programs under the Individual Assistance Declaration. The Individuals and Households Program does not have a cost share match. The 25% match for programs that do have a matching requirement is considered something called a maximum share. And this means that the disaster may qualify for a reduced matching requirement, which has happened a lot recently, especially around COVID. But generally, local jurisdictions should expect to have a cost share requirement for federally declared disasters of 25%. Next slide, please. And this brings me back to my second simple idea, which is that government assistance will not make you whole following a disaster. And in most cases, there is a cost share requirement. And for some programs, there are maximum funding amounts that are allowed, like IHP or the HGP program, meaning that you may have more damages than there are federal funding recovery costs following a disaster. Kind of circling to my last final idea or simple idea, the programs that we just briefly discussed are complicated and each have hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of program-specific rules and policies that govern and distinguish them from one another. The overview today didn't go through the basic requirements of each program, and each could fill dozens and dozens of slides. And for this reason, the SBP team is working hard to ensure that local governments and community leaders are equipped to develop internal experts within their own organizations to help community leaders navigate these programs. FEMA's disaster assistance programs are generally staffed by a lot of really good people, but they are often restrained by the policies and regulations that govern the FEMA team. And by increasing local government capacity and program expertise at the most basic level, our hope is that future leaders will be better equipped to work comfortably with these programs and then utilize them effectively and efficiently. There are a lot of ways to work successfully within the FEMA programs, and often knowing what to ask for, when to ask for it, and what supporting documentation is needed will lead to success at a local level following disaster. Next slide, please. Excuse me. All of the information discussed today is referenced in one of the sources on the screen. Like an inverted triangle, the Stafford Act provides the foundation of emergency management in the United States, and for FEMA and the programs they support. 44 and 2 CFR are the regulations implementing federal agencies to action. And then each program has very specific and detailed policy and procedure guides. And these are all hyperlinked, and the slide deck that you receive will be live links, and so you'll be able to explore these documents at your own pace once the slides are sent out. Next slide, please. And then finally, SBP is creating a program and practitioner training, which will equip leaders with the information necessary to implement the disaster recovery and resilience programs in their communities following a disaster. As Maria mentioned, our first class will be held in May of this year in Savannah, and we're working on getting additional opportunities scheduled. If you would like to attend this May training, or you have questions about future trainings, please feel free to reach out to Maria or I. My email's on the screen. And at this time, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, Josh, there's two questions in the Q&A box.
Okay. Yeah, first one is, can you talk a little bit more about FEMA's recent changes to IHP assistance, such as not having to apply for SBA before receiving individual assistance? Yeah, so on January 19th, I believe, FEMA announced 10 or 11 reforms to their individual assistance programs. These centered around simplifying application processes, adding new types of recovery programs, and then adding more transparency to their programs. Michelle's question specifically about not having to apply for SBA before receiving IA applies to a very specific part of FEMA's ONA grants. And basically, there was previously a requirement to apply for a small business administrative loan before you could receive certain personal property benefits through FEMA's programs. Effective Friday, actually, March 22nd, that will no longer be a requirement. And the personal property benefits that are available to disaster survivors under FEMA's programs will not require an SBA loan application denial before receiving some of those benefits. Some of the other changes that were included in the IHP reforms, and I apologize, this won't be an exhaustive list, but they've expanded habitability requirements. They have provided additional assistance for underinsured providers, or underinsured survivors. There are lessened requirements for appeals. There are more financial benefits available to people that are entrepreneurs or self-employed individuals. And then there's some added benefits for immediate needs assistance following a disaster. Something that SBA has put together is kind of what was the previous policy versus what will be the previous policy effective March 22nd. And Michelle, if you can drop your email in the chat, that's something I could send to you following this presentation. And then second question, what are some of the ways to meet a cost share split between using donated resources, state and local funds, force account labor, etc. So you're spot on, Michelle. There are different ways to cover your cost share. I think probably the most beneficial way to a local government is using donated resources under the PA program specifically. But there are opportunities really depending on where you're at in the country and what state and local government assistance is available. The only way that you can't cover a cost share, which is probably a little easier to explain, is you can't use another federal funding source. That's not allowed in policy. There are very, very few exceptions to that. And then you can't use certain FEMA projects in order to cover a cost share. And so you can't, for example, you can't use your category B emergency protective measures project in order to cover costs associated with your category C roads and bridges project. But by using donated resources and or straight time, which is not allowed as direct payment, but can be covered only using volunteer time from an employee, there are some ways to get around that cost share. And Michelle, along with the IHP email, I'll provide a reference to the Papa G that talks in more detail about cost share requirements and then potential ways to cover that cost share. Any other questions that we can answer. All right. Seeing none, Maria, I will pass it back to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Josh. As a reminder, we ask that you please join us for our next webinars. The links to register will be available in the slides that I sent out later on today. Also, don't forget to reach out to me for more information, as Josh said, on Response to Recovery LPC in May, the disaster housing course, or any future courses. Again, this is just to show you exactly what the Advise team is offering. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. And to continue to go ahead and follow us on social media. We look forward to meeting with you on future webinars or in person at one of our courses. Don't forget to follow us again on social media. We will be emailing out the slide deck from today, so look out for that in your inbox or spam folder. Thank you again on behalf of SBP and the Walmart Foundation. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.